And sometimes there is reluctance by higher level officials to get involved in something, either because they think it's not their job or because they don't want political responsibility for it. And in the United States, Hurricane Katrina illustrated this, as I've already mentioned, with conflict between the mayor, the governor, and the president. There's another kind of boundary there are two other kinds of boundaries that can be difficult. The boundaries between functional departments, police, firefighting, which may be in this, I don't know whether they're in the same ministry here in Indonesia or not, but certainly medical services will be in a different ministry. Public works will be different, etc. Can you cooperate across those boundaries as well? So in the United States, we are reasonably good at working out, although far from perfect, at working out those collaborations across different types of agencies, although the ones that work together more regularly are more likely to work together well than the ones that work together under extreme conditions. We are much less successful in working vertically, having state and local government work well with each other, or national and state governments work, because the officials in those governments are separately elected. They tend to be rivals of each other. Governors want to run for president, mayors want to run for governor, so there are a lot of rivalries. And we also have independently elected legislators, so it's frequently difficult going vertically. In China, they do a very good job. They have an fairly integrated national system, although it's getting less integrated over time, and provinces and sometimes cities have more autonomy than they used to have. Nonetheless, in a great emergency, that vertical dimension of Chinese government works pretty well. As I understand it, the horizontal dimension works terribly in China, although they will have endless committees that work, that meet frequently but don't really work out ways of integrating and working things out in a clear way. I'm over-dramatizing that a little bit, but the horizontal problem is tougher for China and the vertical one is tougher for the United States. I don't know the situation here, but this issue of being able to manage those boundary relationships, whether it's between jurisdictions, levels of government, or organizations, and certainly the boundaries between the public sector and the private sector also are tough, and we need to work on those. By the way, one further comment on this, there are disincentives for effective handoffs. One is that people are reluctant to relinquish control of things once they get involved. They are reluctant because they think they can handle it better than somebody else. Perhaps you have experienced this in your own professional work in non-emergency situations. You've got a problem, you're not handling it as well as you're not solving it, and you think, should I give it to my boss? And then you say, oh, that sucker would do it even worse than I would, so I'm going to keep it. There certainly is a phenomenon there of relying on your own expertise to try to solve things. That's often combined with the fear of losing face by saying, I can't handle this, somebody's got to help me. And those problems which exist for individuals also exist for organizations. It's difficult to surrender your turf and to admit that you're not succeeding. But in a disaster setting, that may be crucial to being able to perform well. The last problem I want to cite, and I will then free you from this imprisonment, is the question of communication. And here we are dealing with a function that is likely to be a combination of both experts and political leaders. During a disaster, the public is going to feel very uncertain, and they're going to be worried about what's happening. What consequences are there for themselves and their families and their physical safety? Are there consequences for the place that I live, in my home, in my shelter and community? Is there a consequence for my job? So there are going to be many worries in a disaster setting that need to be dealt with. And reducing anxiety is an important element. People, too, want to feel like they're in greater control and want to feel that they have a sense of being able to do something to help themselves. All of this, the wrong way. All of this leads us to think about a communications format and there's much more to say about this issue of crisis communication, but a format for communication that can be useful. And my colleague and I sometimes call this the script. What it basically is a set of things for crisis communication. One is to let the public very clearly know what is it that we know, and are there things we don't know that we're working to find out. And often, sometimes in disaster settings, political leaders get in trouble by saying things that turn out to be untrue, or by failing to admit that there are things that they don't know, and over time that shows up and their credibility suffers. Second thing that's important for political leaders or professional leaders to say is, what are we actually doing? How are we responding? We're dispatching these ambulances, we're arranging for air transport to get victims someplace. We have alerted hospitals 100 miles away to receive these victims, etc. And you might also say here that you're doing certain things to fill in your gaps in knowledge. You've requested assistance from the Disease Control Office in the national government, or you have tried to enlist the World Health Organization to help identify whatever disease it is, etc. So what are you doing to fill in the gaps in knowledge? Third, are there things that citizens can do themselves to protect themselves? Sometimes that may mean saying you are safer if you remain inside your house and shelter there. Sometimes it might be to urge them to evacuate. Obviously, it depends on the type of emergency and the circumstances. It also would include telling them where they can get further information. Tune to this radio station or TV station. Here's an internet address that will have information, and tell them that political leaders or whoever are going to come back and brief them. And finally, leaders can give people some help in interpreting the situation. During the 9/11 crisis, Mayor Giuliani was incredibly talented in helping Americans, really New Yorkers first of all, and Americans generally, deal with some of the trauma of this. And he pointed out, even though this was the first time the United States had experienced something like this since Pearl Harbor, on American soil anyway, he pointed out other countries that had suffered similar kinds of losses. He pointed out Great Britain during the Blitz in World War II, and was able to help the citizens of New York and Americans more generally understand this. He also pleaded for tolerance, and I think very appropriately and somewhat courageously said not to blame people of a particular religion, obviously Muslims, but rather the individuals who had committed these crimes, and not, to try to prevent people from civil disorder that might point at particular ethnic groups or nationality groups. There's a great deal more to say on this. I won't say it. I think my last slide simply begins to identify some of the obstacles to improvement in the United States. And some of these might apply in Indonesia, some of them may not. We have divided authority between national government and states, and indeed states have certain guaranteed authority that the national government can interfere with only slightly. Also, there is a great deal of autonomy of our local governments from state governments. So that division of authority sometimes makes it very hard to get policy agreement on preparedness, or to take action during crises, or even to cooperate on recovery. Second of all, each of these levels of government have different constellation of stakeholders and interest groups, and so that the stakeholders of a city government are going to be different, and perhaps be different in balance than those of a provincial government or of the national leadership. That makes it hard to relate to each other. Budgeting tends to be, and I don't know whether you've experienced this, the national government is willing to put lots of money into emergency management when there's been a crisis. As time passes by, if there's not another crisis, that money starts to go to other purposes. And so the budgets for emergency preparedness go up and down like waves in the ocean, and it's very hard to produce plans and build consistent capacity. We have a term